Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and participants who are joining us online. I'm Mandeep Dhaliwal. I'm the director of UNDP's HIV Health and Development Group, and I'm going to be your moderator for what promises to be a very exciting discussion today. Leaving no one behind is a public health and human rights imperative, as has been brought into stark relief by both HIV and the COVID pandemic. Vulnerability, including in the context of HIV, is fueled by intersecting forms of stigma and discrimination. It is also exacerbated by unequal access to services and inequality before the law. We have a surfeit of evidence which shows that human rights barriers, stigma and discrimination translate into inequalities in HIV outcomes. This week, a paper published by the HIV Policy Lab, hosted by the O'Neill Institute, added to this body of evidence. We also heard in an editorial in The Lancet, which noted that a successful HIV response is predicated on equality in access to services and equality before the law. UNDP is a proud co-sponsor of UNAIDS, and together with governments, UN partners, civil society, and other partners like the Global Fund, we are working with 90 countries to dismantle the human rights, legal, and policy barriers that assault human dignity and impede successful HIV responses. So before we get on with our speakers, just a few housekeeping matters. The event is being recorded and is being shown on YouTube. I'd ask everyone who's not speaking to please mute your microphones. We will have time for questions at the end, and please do use the chat. I encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring. For those on Zoom, there's interpretation in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. You'll find the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. And we would ask that speakers please speak slowly to help the interpreters. I haven't done a very good job of that, while keeping to their time. So it now gives me great pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Epsie Campbell-Barr, the Vice President of Costa Rica. Her Excellency Campbell-Barr is the first Afro-descendant woman to hold this position in the Americas. Her Excellency directs Costa Rica's National Plan for Women's Economic Empowerment and Leadership, and oversees implementation of the International Decade of People of African Descent and its action plans. This week, under her leadership, Costa Rica also officially joined the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of HIV-related stigma and discrimination. It is my honor to now hand over to Her Excellency to open this event. Your Excellency, you're welcome.
Muchísimas gracias. Para mí es un gran placer, y para el gobierno de Costa Rica, estar en un evento virtual que pasa de las promesas a las acciones, que permite ampliar todos los esfuerzos para enfrentar los obstáculos a los derechos humanos que están incluidos en el estigma y la discriminación relacionados con el VIH. Muy buenos días, quiero felicitar las discusiones, quiero felicitar los compromisos y quiero felicitar a todas las personas que nos acompañan el día de hoy en este evento tan especial. Hemos escuchado reiteradamente que a pesar de los numerosos avances científicos en la prevención y el tratamiento, así como en la generalización de las actividades de concientización, el miedo irracional a la infección del VIH y las actitudes negativas hacia las personas que viven con esta condición son obstáculos que persisten. El estigma relacionado con el VIH resulta mucho más evidente en las actitudes, comportamientos y juicios irracionales o propiciados por el miedo que existe hacia las personas que viven con el VIH, sus parejas, sus familias, así como con los grupos relacionados. La discriminación relacionada con el VIH puede verse agravada por otras formas de discriminación, por ejemplo, las basadas en la raza, en el sexo, en la condición socioeconómica, en la orientación sexual, en la edad, en la identidad, en el género y en el origen nacional. Y por eso generar una alianza internacional robusta, con el liderazgo de los países, con el compromiso de los líderes de las organizaciones sociales, con la visión de las Naciones Unidas, con los aliados estratégicos que cada vez son más en las empresas y en el sector privado, se convierte en un elemento fundamental para la construcción de esas nuevas sociedades libres de discriminación. Por eso, derribar el estigma del VIH y poner fin a la discriminación de las personas que viven con VIH tiene una importancia fundamental, ya que estos problemas impiden que esas personas accedan no solo a los servicios de prevención, pruebas y tratamiento, sino a sus más elementales derechos humanos. Y por eso Costa Rica tiene un importante compromiso con la Alianza Global para eliminar el estigma y la discriminación asociada con el VIH. En diciembre del 2019, mi país saldó su deuda histórica con la aprobación de una reforma de ley que justamente me tocó firmar en ese entonces como presidenta en ejercicio. Esta reforma tuvo como objetivo regular todas las acciones del Estado costarricense para poder promover y garantizar un enfoque integral de derechos humanos a las personas que viven con VIH en los ámbitos públicos y privados, para desterrar las profundas raíces de lo que conocemos como discriminación, que ha sido un inaceptable pretexto para colocar a unos seres humanos sobre otros. Hoy me siento muy contenta porque con esa ley y con el compromiso del gobierno avanzamos decididamente para acabar de raíz con el estigma que viven las personas con VIH y que ha limitado la adopción de políticas públicas y legislación que garanticen el acceso universal a la salud desde toda la integridad. Esta ley, vigente desde el año 2019, cambió radicalmente el enfoque del VIH e integró una visión de derechos humanos. Realizó la inclusión de conceptos importantes como el enfoque de género en los derechos humanos, el de la violencia contra las mujeres, el enfoque médico y el tratamiento para la prevención y atención, de manera que integral para asegurarnos que la ciudadanía tuviera la información plena, porque muy importante es que la ciudadanía se comporte y empiece a actuar de manera informada, entendiendo los estragos que causa en la vida de las personas el estigma y la discriminación relacionada con el VIH. Los datos que tenemos son absolutamente contundentes y sabemos además que es imprescindible para el cumplimiento de la agenda de los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible erradicar de raíz la discriminación que existe hacia las personas que viven con VIH. No es posible pensar que vamos a llegar al 2030 sin que actuemos de manera consensuada para erradicar la discriminación y el estigma. La situación que vivimos producto del COVID-19 ha evidenciado que muchas de las personas afectadas por el VIH desde hace años no han tenido la posibilidad de tener la atención necesaria en tiempos de pandemia y han enfrentado obstáculos adicionales a los obstáculos que ya enfrentaban. Los nuevos objetivos de la Estrategia Mundial sobre el VIH y el SIDA indican lo que hay que hacer y para ello debemos de aumentar significativamente el financiamiento y la acción. Cuenten con el pleno concurso de mi país, Costa Rica, que ha pasado de las promesas a las acciones, que ha ampliado los esfuerzos contra los obstáculos a los derechos humanos y que hoy trabaja decididamente contra el estigma y la discriminación. Cuenten con un país comprometido con los derechos humanos de las personas que viven con VIH, pero también cuenten con un país que promueve un modelo de desarrollo inclusivo, justo, sin discriminación para ninguna persona, sostenible, que sea capaz de heredar justicia e igualdad a las próximas generaciones. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and thank you for highlighting the intersectionality of the many issues that we need to address and for the call to action, which is very important. We need to move from discussion and words to concrete action to eliminate stigma and discrimination and the human rights barriers that are holding us back. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Winnie Byanyima, who is the Executive Director of UNAIDS. Winnie has, under her bold leadership, she has helped the world to secure an ambitious new global AIDS strategy, as well as supported the member state process for the political declaration, which was gavelled in yesterday. She is a passionate and longstanding champion of social justice and gender equality, fighting to empower people to create a future that is secure and just and free from stigma and discrimination. Before joining UNAIDS, Ms. Byanyima served as the executive director of Oxfam International and served her country of Uganda for 11 years in the parliament. Winnie, UNAIDS has recently adopted its global AIDS strategy 2021 to 2026, which sets out new and very ambitious targets for 2025. These are now in the political declaration, which is an incredible feat. Why the heightened focus in the global AIDS strategy on breaking down human rights barriers, inequalities, stigma, and discrimination? I look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Winnie.
Thank you, Mandeep. It's always a pleasure to be working with you on a panel like this one. And greetings to my fellow panelists, colleagues, and friends online. The COVID pandemic has brought to the fore what those affected by HIV have known for years, that inequalities, stigma, and discrimination are magnified in times of crisis and leave behind those most marginalized, those at the bottom. These two intersecting pandemics, HIV and COVID-19, provided the backdrop against which the new UNAIDS global strategy for the next 5 years, up to 2026, was developed. For 40 years, we've known that a human rights-based approach is essential to ensuring people-centered, effective responses. But this knowledge has not always resulted in action. We felt that this must change. So the new global AIDS strategy, I often hesitate to call it a UNAIDS strategy because some people then confuse it with the work of UNAIDS, but it is a global AIDS strategy for the whole world to use, to contextualize, and to fight up to the end. This new global AIDS strategy lays out a map to get the world back on track to end AIDS by 2030, as is in the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. It recognizes that only by ending inequalities through removing human rights barriers, through equalizing the enjoyment of human rights, will we end AIDS by 2030 for everyone. It recognizes that gender inequalities and harmful gender norms deprive women and girls their autonomy over their bodies, denies them the power to make decisions about their lives and health. Discriminatory laws and policies hinder adolescent girls and young women from exercising their sexual and reproductive health rights. Because of this, AIDS remains one of the leading causes of death for women aged between 15 and 49 years globally. When I was growing up, men in my country would say, I have 3 children and 1 girl, meaning that I have 3 boys and 1 girl. Children were boys. A girl was a disposable asset you sell off at marriage. In many countries in my region, Africa, marital rape is still not a crime because a woman's body is assumed to be owned by the husband, the man who's married her. So stigma, discrimination, violence, and punitive laws undermine the HIV response. They prevent people living with HIV, key populations, and by this I mean men who have sex with men, sex workers, transgender people, people who inject drugs, prisoners, and other groups at risk, highly at risk of HIV. They are prevented from accessing services and protecting their health. Key populations targeted by criminal laws are up to 7 times more likely to be living with HIV than those in legally supportive environments. In 2019, key populations and their sexual partners accounted for 62% of new infections globally. In some regions, rates of infection among key populations are actually increasing. To this day, 67 countries still criminalize same-sex sexual activity. That includes my own country, Uganda. 92 criminalize HIV transmission, HIV exposure, and non-disclosure. 32 criminalize or prosecute transgender people, and almost all countries still criminalize personal drug use and aspects of sex work. This has to change, and that's why our new strategy includes targets for what we call societal enablers. If we reach these targets, then by 2025, less than 10% of people living with or affected by HIV will experience stigma and discrimination. Less than 10% of people will experience gender-based inequalities and gender-based violence. And less than 10% of countries will have punitive laws and policies in place. My friends, I'm passionate about fighting stigma because stigma kills. Stigma killed my brother. He was HIV positive and would be living today, but he was afraid to go to the clinic to fetch his ARVs because people he knew would find him there and would judge him. We have to fight stigma and discrimination. They kill. Failure to reach these new targets will result in an additional 1.7 million AIDS-related deaths and 2.5 million additional new HIV infections in the next 10 years. In the face of these numbers, to continue as we have is unconscionable. We have to do things differently. We need a radical upscaling of political commitment. We need funding, and we need actions on human rights to reduce inequalities that impact the most at risk, the most vulnerable. UNAIDS is working with UNDP, UN Women, GNP+, which is an international NGO led by people living with HIV, Global Fund, communities and governments through the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of HIV-related stigma and discrimination. It's a long name. I want to recognize the 21 countries that have committed in this partnership and call on others also to make that commitment today. Join this partnership and let's fight discrimination and stigma. We continue to engage and support a broad range of stakeholders, from governments to courts, to continue making the case that it is imperative to remove human rights barriers. And today, we are launching a series of human rights fact sheets on a range of topics, including on key populations and stigma and discrimination. We encourage you to use them and in our joint efforts to change the status quo that continues to push many to the margins of our society and away from life-saving health technologies. This is a difficult but exciting time. I can't remember the last time so many people across the world were advocating for a human rights approach to health. We must seize this opportunity and we must act. I believe we can and we will. And I ask you to join us in fighting to end those inequalities that drive AIDS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Winnie. And thank you for setting out the context and the scope and scale of the challenge, but also then for providing a very compelling rationale for using a human rights framework and approach, removing human rights barriers to achieve the equality, which we know is central to reaching the end of AIDS and getting the AIDS response back on track by 2026 or 2025. With that, let me now move to introducing someone who is a dear friend, Edwin Cameron, the inspecting judge of prisons, the South African Constitutional Court. Edwin was a justice of the South Africa's Constitutional Court until 2019. Since then has taken up the role of the Chancellor of Stellenbosch University and is also the inspecting judge of the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. He was a human rights lawyer during apartheid and was appointed judge by President Mandela in 1994. He is a dear friend and an inspiration to many of us who've been working on HIV for 4 decades now. Mr. Cameron, Edwin, as a lawyer and a judge, you've personally witnessed the effects of inadequate access to justice, punitive and discriminatory laws and policies on people and fought against them. Could you please tell us a little bit more about the impact of legal environments and what impact they can have on inequalities and the right to health? And what, in your opinion, do we need to do if we are to see meaningful progress? Over to you, Edwin.
Good morning, Mandeep, friends, colleagues, allies. It's a joy to be here, a joy to be introduced by you, Mandeep, and a joy to have heard the cogent presentation from Vice President Epsie Campbell and from Winnie Byanyima. And of course, I'm very glad, Winnie, that you mentioned prisoners, because in my new post-retirement role as inspecting judge of prisoners, they are very, very close to my heart. Mandeep, I'm particularly honored because today we mark also on Saturday the somber 40th anniversary of the first official tabulation of AIDS in the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports of 5th of June 1981. And as you say, my life has enabled me in 2 capacities to witness powerfully the negative effect of discriminatory laws and policies on people who are affected by this fearsome epidemic. My first capacity is as someone living with HIV myself. Winnie, I didn't know about your brother, and I'm deeply moved and grateful to you that you mentioned him. I became infected in the mid-1980s, in the terrible years before treatment options existed or became accessible. I later fell terribly ill with AIDS. So I know from deep experience in my deepest being, also as a proudly gay man, a man who has sex with men, a same-sex oriented identifying man, the terrible stigma and discrimination that continue to characterize responses to marginalized groups in AIDS. My second capacity, Mandeep, as you've said, is as someone who's served my country as a judge. I have seen how the absence of enabling legal environments and inadequate access to justice, plus the presence of punitive and discriminatory laws, as Winnie has explained, all of these create and exacerbate inequalities and inequities, and they substantially damage effective responses to HIV. Like Winnie, I speak as a proud African, a white African, but an African from the region that is still the most burdened by HIV. And it is therefore to me a joyful affirmation that these new UNAIDS strategies underscore equality and the ending of inequalities as the heart of the new approach. Equality and a rights-based framework lie at the core of our response. And I want to emphasize the role over the last 40 years that brave and principled and angry activists in ACT UP, but also on my own continent, in the treatment action campaign led by Zaki Ahmed, they put rights and justice and equality at the core of the AIDS struggle, and they brought marginalized groups, rightly for the reasons that Winnie has given, to the very center of our struggle. This was about living and dying, about wellness and sickness, and we have seen how powerfully negative discrimination is. The result is plain. Stigma remains a dark burden on those living with and at risk of HIV. Discrimination permeates the legal environment, and law reforms have been totally insufficient. The statistics Winnie has just mentioned remain appalling. They target people like me, queer people. They target people on the basis of their gender identity, HIV status, drug use, involvement in sex works. And we see how the poisonous perils of discrimination intermingle through the intersectionality and converge. In doing so, the heavy hand of the criminal law exacerbates the inequalities, inequities, and exclusions that undermine efficacy in this epidemic. And these laws ultimately do not leave people behind. They actively shove them out. The discrimination also flows through collecting empirical data. How can we possibly remove barriers to access services if we do not even see the people that they are crushing? Many interventions are needed to render people visible, queer people, sex workers, prisoners, like Winnie mentioned, those using drugs, those marginalized on the basis of their gender identity. An enabling legal environment means that we use the law to empower rather than to oppress. Criminal laws must go. Equality before the law must be achieved for all marginalized groups at risk of HIV and living with HIV. It's not only about laws, it involves how the laws are drafted and implemented. Again here, Mandeep and Winnie and Vice President Epsie Campbell, I emphasize the role of civil society. The treatment activists demanded justice, and as Winnie has said, in demanding justice and equality, we also promote the most effective means of minimizing the dire impact of HIV and AIDS. Ensuring access to justice and meaningful participation for all is pivotal. Ending AIDS by 2030 is achievable, but to do so, we must respect, protect, and fulfill the basic human rights of people living with HIV and key populations. We must put them at the center of our response, provide the resources, as Vice President Epsie Campbell has said, and foster an enabling social, political, and legal environment. A rights-based approach to marginalization, to equality. I speak as a lawyer, I speak as a queer man, I speak as someone living with HIV. Let's grab that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Edwin, and a powerful testimonial for the importance of civil society, the power of people to make the law work more effectively for the HIV response. And we're going to come back to, I think, a lot of what you've said when we get to the discussion. Let me now introduce Sohaila Ben Said. She's the president of the Association Tunisienne de Prévention Positive. Ms. Ben Said has been an HIV activist since 2007, when she started as a volunteer and then was appointed as the program manager with the Association Tunisienne de Lutte contre le Sida. In 2011, she co-founded the Facebook-based international women's movement Words of Women, as well as the MENA-based Women Living with HIV regional network, known to many of us, MENA Rosa. In 2021, Sohaila co-founded MENA Plus, a regional network of persons living with HIV. Ms. Ben Said, for many years now, you have fought for gender equality and for the rights of women, especially women living with HIV in all their diversity, to be recognized as human rights. What, in your view, should we be prioritizing to ensure gender equality and the end of AIDS for women? Over to you. You're very welcome. Sohaila.
Mesdames et messieurs, les représentants et représentantes des États membres, chers représentants et représentantes de la société civile et des communautés de populations clés et vulnérables, chers participantes et participants à ce panel. Je suis heureuse tout d'abord et fière d'être parmi vous. Je suis heureuse que la lumière reste vive quand il s'agit des droits humains, de l'égalité du genre et des droits de tous et toutes, sans discrimination, à l'accès à la prévention combinée, au dépistage, aux soins de santé et au traitement et à la protection sociale. L'appartenance à une région ou à une culture ou à un contexte socio-économique ne peuvent être une excuse pour nier ces droits. Dans le monde entier, en particulier dans notre région du Moyen-Orient et de l'Afrique du Nord, la région MENA, nous, les femmes et les jeunes, en toute leur diversité, transgenres, lesbiennes, bisexuelles, vivant avec le VIH, travailleurs et travailleuses de sexe, femmes qui vivent des violences, usagères de drogues injectables, prisonniers et prisonnières, porteuses d'handicap, migrantes, vulnérables, nous sommes encore laissés pour compte. Nous vivons encore toutes sortes de stigmatisation et de discrimination, de violence, d'exclusion, d'inégalités croisées. Nous sommes vulnérables car nous sommes femmes. Nous sommes plus vulnérables en étant que femmes vivant avec le VIH-Sida en toute leur diversité ou appartenant à des populations clés. Les lois punitives existantes depuis des décennies dans notre région nous privent de nos droits et nuancent notre citoyenneté. Ces lois, ces discriminations bloquent notre accès aux services de prévention combinée et de dépistage. Elles entravent notre accès au traitement, aux soins de qualité, à la protection sociale et menacent de ne pas rendre possible l'engagement de nos pays à mettre fin au sida d'ici 2030. D'ailleurs, les chiffres de l'ONU-SIDA le montrent bien et au-delà des chiffres, nous sommes témoins de cette négation des droits sur le terrain. J'appelle nos gouvernements et nos législateurs à prendre conscience de la réalité de nos contextes, au-delà des barrières culturelles et légales, et prendre et mettre en œuvre des décisions qui répondent aux vrais besoins des femmes et des jeunes dans toute leur diversité, sans discrimination, à une vraie et une meilleure coordination avec la société civile et avec nous, les communautés, dans notre diversité. Il est temps que nos gouvernements, nos parlementaires, nos juges et nos forces de l'ordre prennent conscience que notre appel à travailler ensemble est aussi bénéfique pour le futur de la société en général. Les droits humains de chacun et chacune sont indépendants et indivisibles. Protéger nos droits, c'est aussi protéger les leurs. À s'impliquer et à s'imbiber plus des réalités et des besoins rencontrés sur le terrain, des documents stratégiques politiquement corrects qui ignorent notre voix, notre action et nos vrais besoins n'aboutiront pas à nos objectifs et aux objectifs de mettre fin au VIH-Sida d'ici 2030. À abroger les lois punitives dans les meilleurs des délais car 2030 est à la porte. Il est honteux qu'en 2021, dans notre région, des personnes vivant avec le VIH ne jouissent pas de leurs droits à la circulation entre les pays ni au travail. J'appelle aussi les États membres et les bailleurs de fonds à concrétiser leur engagement, en particulier dans notre région MENA, en matière de solidarité. Les fonds pour la riposte au VIH-Sida tarissent. Ne soyez pas surpris que les résultats ne suivent pas. Nous, les femmes et les jeunes, dans toute notre diversité, seront les premières victimes du manque de financement adéquat et adapté aux réels besoins de nos communautés en matière de prévention, de lutte contre la stigmatisation et de discrimination, de traitement et de soins, de prise en charge et de protection sociale. Je voudrais enfin nous féliciter de l'adoption de la déclaration politique 2021, mettre fin aux inégalités pour mettre fin au sida 2030, la stratégie de l'ONU-SIDA 21-26 nous montre la voie Mon souhait le plus profond est que sa mise en œuvre soit réelle dans la région MENA, que nous, les femmes et les jeunes, les communautés concernées, la société civile, soyons les partenaires de nos gouvernements et que ceux qui réalisent que mettre fin au sida dépasse la mise à disposition du traitement, mais qu'il s'agit réellement de la pleine jouissance des droits par toutes et tous dans la pleine diversité. D'ailleurs, la pandémie du Covid l'a bien démontré. Si les efforts de riposte contre le sida étaient plus centrés sur les droits et la non-discrimination, le genre, l'intégration socio-économique et l'accès universel, la riposte au Covid-19 aurait énormément gagné en force. Nothing for us without us. And educate and don't punish. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ben Said, and I think very well said in terms of the role of women living with HIV and women in all their diversity, and how critical it is to not just protect their rights, but to also promote their rights. And I think that's very important. It is now my pleasure to introduce Peter Sands, the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. He is also a research fellow at Harvard University, both at Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Global Health Institute. A graduate from Oxford and Harvard, Peter has served on various boards and commissions throughout his career, including the UK's Department of Health, the World Economic Forum, and the International Advisory Board of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And I would like to pay tribute to Peter in particular for his leadership at the Global Fund during the COVID pandemic, and keeping a laser-like focus on protecting the gains of the HIV response thus far. Peter, we've been hearing a lot about the need to increase resources allocated to addressing human rights barriers, fighting inequalities, criminalization, ending stigma and discrimination. The new UNAIDS strategy even estimates that the investment in societal enablers must more than double by 2025. The Global Fund, through its strategy, has dedicated funding for human rights, gender, and community. So what do we need to do to meet the investment needs and to scale up the investment in human rights and to scale up human rights interventions to the levels that are needed to end AIDS by 2030? Over to you, Peter. You're very welcome.
Thanks, Mandeep. And let me start actually by acknowledging and thanking those in the communities on the front line, the activists that Edwin was talking about, who are combating human rights abuses and fighting stigma and discrimination every day. I think it's really important that we in global health agencies acknowledge that, in a sense, we are enablers. We're enablers of those who are doing the doing. But I'd also like to acknowledge and thank member states, and Costa Rica is a great example, that are showing the way and being prepared to take tough decisions and show real leadership on human rights issues. And finally, I'd like to thank Winnie and UNAIDS for your bold, strong leadership on these issues. It is, as Edward noted, a rather sobering fact that we have been living now with HIV for over 40 years. And we have lost a lot of people, far, far too many lives. And although we have made progress, we have a huge amount still to do. It's also this year the 20th anniversary of the Global Fund. It was at a G8 in those days meeting in 2001 that the idea of a global fund to fight what was then the exploding pandemic of HIV/AIDS was endorsed. Now, it's an interesting reflection that it took 20 years from those first cases being tabulated by the CDC for an effective global response to be mounted. Now, in that 20 years, since the Global Fund was created, much has been achieved, but also many lessons have been learned. And one of the biggest lessons, I think, that has been learned is that we will not beat HIV unless we tackle the human rights and gender-related barriers that prevent so many of the most affected communities from accessing health services, whether preventative services, information, or treatment. And we've also learned that tackling these barriers is not just about promises. It does take money, and it does take political courage. It does take enormous persistence, and it does take partnership. There is no one agency, no one community group, no one actor that can kind of solve all these things. We have to work together. The Global Fund has been on a learning curve about this. I think in the early days, we probably said a lot about human rights related things, but weren't quite sure how to tackle them. I think we've seen in the last grant cycle a marked increase in focus and resourcing on human rights and gender related barriers. In the last grant cycle, the last 3-year cycle, over $120 million was devoted to work on human rights related barriers, of which a third was specifically around stigma and discrimination. And in the countries where our Breaking Down Barriers initiative was rolled out, we saw a sevenfold increase from a very low base, admittedly, increase in funding on human rights related issues. But I think we've also learned that money, this is not a problem you can throw money at. You need the money, but you also need the leadership, the expertise, the legal expertise, the activism as well. And I think one of the great, very encouraging things from the Breaking Down Barriers initiative is the levels of increased country ownership and actual multi-stakeholder engagement on these issues we've seen in those countries. Now, we have just begun the new grant cycle. And as part of that grant cycle, we are committed to building on the progress we had made with breaking down barriers, with our initiatives around adolescent girls and young women, with the work that's done with people who inject drugs, both learning the lessons, the things that work well, the things that didn't work so effectively, but also scaling up the interventions, committing more resources, committing more time and energy to the advocacy and activism. As co-convener of the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of Stigma, Discrimination, and like Winnie, I note the very long name of this partnership. We are committed to ensuring that all the programs we support, the grants that we make, further these goals, not just in the countries in which we are focusing the Breaking Down Barriers initiative. The new targets in the global AIDS strategy, I think, are very powerful as a catalyst for greater action on stigma, on discrimination, on human rights, on gender-related barriers. Achieving them will not be easy. I don't think we should kid ourselves that this is going to be easy to do, but achieve them we must, because if we are serious about ending AIDS as an epidemic, HIV/AIDS as an epidemic by 2030, we can only do that if we address these barriers. And while we're about it, and you mentioned, Mandeep, the current context, the COVID-19 crisis, I think we need to be, and Winnie has shown leadership in this already, we need to be infusing all we have learned about inequities, gender-related barriers, human rights issues from the fight against HIV into the way we are approaching the response to COVID-19. The language of rights, justice, equality is not the language of most countries' COVID-19 responses. And indeed, in many of these responses, we've actually seen advances on human rights rolled back or trampled on or ignored. We've seen stigma and discrimination increase. We need to ensure this is reversed, because it would be all too easy for the next phase of the fight against COVID-19 to evolve into something that looks remarkably like what we have seen with HIV, with TB, where those in rich countries get protected and the marginalized, the discriminated, the poor are the ones who remain at risk and suffering. And so we need to use and leverage all we have learned and the energy we have within the HIV/AIDS movement to achieve our aims for HIV/AIDS, but also to infuse the way we think about COVID with the same values. And it's not just about HIV/AIDS and COVID. What I think is at stake actually is the way we think about global health and the way we think about global health inequities and rights to health. So the stakes are I think I was just muted by somebody.
Oh, sorry.
I was saying, I think the stakes are incredibly high. They're very high for those of us who are passionate about the fight against HIV/AIDS, but they're even higher because the HIV/AIDS community is the beacon and the pathfinder for everyone who cares about inequities and rights to health. So I think this is an incredibly timely meeting, just on the eve of the G7, at the point where at a crucial stage, both in the fight against HIV and in the fight against COVID-19, and when all these debates are unfolding about how the world is going to approach global health. We need that language of rights, of justice, of inequities and equality to be part of that. So thank you. I'll stop there, Mandy.
Thanks so much, Peter. And yeah, just on the G7, it was very jarring to see the declaration from the health ministers that didn't even mention HIV, TB, malaria. It was striking. So I think your point about infusing the lessons from HIV into responses to other health issues, including COVID, is very, very pertinent and very important. Okay, let's move on to Harry Prabowo, and we'll come back to some of the points that Peter has raised about the importance of funding, the importance of communities on the front lines, and the importance of actually investing in human rights interventions in our discussion and our Q&A. Harry Prabowo is from the Global Network of People Living with HIV. He's the Asia Pacific Regional Coordinator. He's currently based in Bangkok, and he is the Regional Community Coordinator for the Global Partnership for Action to Eliminate All Forms of HIV-related Stigma and Discrimination, and he's a member of its Technical Working Group. Welcome, Harry. My question for you is that one of the biggest gaps we're seeing around human rights is converting commitment to action, and Peter touched upon this as well. What is being done, and what more do we need to do to ensure sufficient and effective action on human rights? Harry, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Mandy. So for a start, good afternoon and good evening and good morning for everyone. Okay, I think before we start, I'm gonna talk about, let's talk about the human rights barriers on HIV. When we talk about it, we right away thinking about injustice and inequality, which intersecting with stigma, discrimination, They're still embedded in law and policy. This situation will not only hinder access to HIV service, but it also does harm to the community by aggravating the HIV, creating health threats, obstructing them from acquiring information and making use of the health services in order to protect their health. Just like Winnie said, as we, the community, when we accessing the HIV services, it should be out of fear of being recognized, discrimination against, judged, or even arrested. The good example from the hostile law and policy environment is among people who inject drugs in the context of Asia Pacific, where I reside. This situation has led to downfall of the harm reduction approach and create challenge in the service delivery response, including HIV, hepatitis, and TB. It might also create a further adverse impact if there is still criminalization of sex work, same-sex relation, gender identity, and/or expression. In response to that, an initiative was launched called the Global Partnership. It's an initiative that focuses on the attention to work around stigma and unite stakeholders across levels by choosing the most strategic and effective approaches to support better intervention, measure the progress on stigma reduction, and report it. The Global Partnership is also recognized while the commitments are in place. It needs to accelerate it, scale it up, and to further action. The Global Partnership focusing on stigma discrimination that exists across all facets of society, including health, education, workplace, community, justice, and humanitarian setting. The partnership is co-convened by key organizations which are providing the structure, technical support, advocating the resource, and providing platform for community and civil society to lead this work. 30 countries has been invited to join by choosing 3 priority settings that they want to do on HIV-related stigma, and also share their progress by ensuring the government, UN agency, donors, civil society are working together through strong partnership. I would like to share the progress on the Global Partnership in the context of Asia Pacific, where I reside, where I'm currently now. 4 countries have committed to join Global Partnership: Thailand, Papua New Guinea, Nepal, and Laos PDR. However, the results vary from country to country. In Thailand, the Partnership Committee under the CCM has facilitated the development of stigma and discrimination reduction framework, including the costed plan through strong partnership between community, government, and stakeholders. In Papua New Guinea, they have a key population advocacy consortium that has roles not only on advocacy, but also to build the community leadership to ensure the meaningful engagement of the community to the Global Partnership. They even receive a full support from the UN agency, including UNAIDS, but not from the stakeholder due to their still busy focusing on COVID-19 pandemic. In Nepal, in here, we have a united PLHIV and key population with strong presence and leadership. The community is ready to support the government commitment, but the stakeholders are not returning the community willingness to engage the Global Partnership. And again, COVID-19 is being used as an excuse. Last but not least, we have Laos. In here, the community in the country is overshadowed by the government presence. They seem lost on how to start the community engagement to the Global Partnership due to no support being provided from any stakeholders. Under the Global Partnership, a social media global campaign was launched this year. It's called More Than. The More Than campaign is led by the global network of people living with HIV and supported by co-convener and network of people living with HIV and key population. It was launched on March 1st on Zero Discrimination Day. The campaign will be rolled out throughout this year with special focus on certain setting and population. The rationale behind the More Than campaign is to fight stigma through celebrating the diversity of life, achievement, and dreams in the PHIV and key population community. Can I have my slide, please? The More Than campaign is also focused on raising awareness about the successful intervention and experience we have fighting stigma and discrimination so far. So please take a look at us. We are more than our HIV status, whatever positive or negative, and more than any label that denies our inherent complexity. We are all individuals with multiple identities, interests, passion, and dreams. As the conclusion, for an effective response on HIV-related stigma, the response should work to address the concern and issue of the community. The community leadership need to be built and empowered in order for them to be able to raise their concern through a safe space of feedback system. The achievement on impactful stigma response, stakeholder across levels should acknowledge and familiarize with the diversity of the community, working together through a strong partnership. Stakeholders should also continue with their commitment despite the current COVID pandemic or any other future pandemic. And last but not least, injustice, inequality that lead to the hostile law and policy environment is to be reformed with the right pace and people-centered approach to ensure the global commitment to an AIDS is achieved by 2030. That's all I can say to everybody. Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you so much, Harry. That was incredible, and thank you for that beautiful slide. It really, I think, says so much of what you were trying to encapsulate in your remarks about the diversity, the importance of addressing intersecting inequalities, and the empowerment of community leadership and community responses. And I think that's critical to effective action on human rights. And we've heard that from so many of the speakers, that it's the activists, it's the people living with HIV, the key populations, the communities on the front lines who are really bearing the brunt of human rights barriers and violations, but also the ones driving effective action on human rights. So thank you. Let me now move on to Lois Pace, who's the Director of Global Health at Health and Human Services in the United States. She's the Director of Global Affairs. She's spent over a decade working with community-based organizations and grassroots leaders in countries across Africa and Asia on campaigns calling for people-centered access to health. Lois is now responsible for advancing the US's international health agenda through multilateral and bilateral fora. You sit at the crossroads, Lois, of US domestic and global health responses across a variety of diseases, including HIV and COVID-19. In your view, what are the priority actions we must take to confront persistent human rights barriers, inequalities, stigma, discrimination, and violence to end the global AIDS epidemic? So what are the priority actions that we need to take? Over to you, Lois. You're very welcome.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Dhaliwal, for moderating this critically important panel discussion, and my regards to each of the panelists, including the Vice President of Costa Rica, but also others who have just offered such compelling remarks. And I will try and add to that by first acknowledging that we can't talk about any of this without recognizing that we are still living through a pandemic, and the ways that COVID-19 has laid bare all of the issues, including stigma and discrimination, that we've always known have been barriers to progress for people living with HIV and other communities that have been underserved by our programs and services, and yet here we are. And so that's always been a grounding point for me over the past year and a half, really recognizing that the pandemic has truly worsened inequalities and widened gaps and really threatened the hard-won gains that we have all been trying to make across a range of health priorities, not limited to HIV, but absolutely including HIV. We also see the impact that COVID-19 has had in chronic diseases, in childhood vaccinations or immunizations, and reproductive health services, and other areas such as violence against women and the like. And so I think it's important for us at HHS to really consider this holistically. And I appreciate the comments in that regard, and for us to really recognize how people are affected broadly, and frankly learn from as much as we can from the ways that issues such as HIV/AIDS have have already taught us how we can approach some of the barriers and shortcomings that have, again, been unveiled, if you will, by COVID-19. For me, that's really looking at these sort of actions threefold. And I guess that would be, in one way, we are really needing to shore up our health systems, which is not always the most exciting conversation to have. And yet I think it's critically essential that we look more closely at our systems and ensure those are strong and resilient. It's also a matter of looking closely at health equity and what we mean by equity, where we're still falling short in terms of equity and how we move forward. And then finally, really lifting up our allies and ensuring that champions are leading the way for us to sort of address issues along those other two areas. And so I'll kind of frame my comments that way to the degree it's helpful. But first, as we think about systems, we all know how critical it is for us to have these strong and resilient systems for people living with HIV, as well as those affected by COVID-19. And again, for the range of issues from AIDS to Zika. And so you have something, I think one challenge that we have is how we break that down. And one way we can think about health systems and strengthening those as an entry point has been thinking just at baseline about primary health care and those services and the opportunity we have to boost primary health care so that it truly addresses health disparities. You know, when we think about the opportunities to change someone's experience at a community level with healthcare and health services, and the ways that just fundamental or day-to-day needs are or are not being met. And that's an important entry point for us here at the U.S. government, and especially as we consider diseases and their effect on people across the life course, really addressing the needs of children, adolescents, and adults, for example, not to mention the range of people who are disproportionately affected by the range of health conditions that I've mentioned, right? So people who identify as women, the LGBTQI community, racial and ethnic minority groups, and obviously people living with HIV, cancer, and other chronic conditions. And so that's it's an important starting point for us to really think about what it means to rebuild our systems in a way that best serves people who are sort of still being left behind. And this is not to discredit the hard work of people on the front lines. This has also been acknowledged, especially our healthcare workforce, because we know that without people who oftentimes are the first people to identify these problems and these gaps, we wouldn't be as far as we've gotten in COVID-19, HIV, or otherwise. Now, when I think about health equity, it's really important also to link these two, right? And obviously, we in the US experience this, and I think we see this around the world, the challenges to access and the barriers, I should say, to access to primary healthcare and to strong, resilient health systems. And of course, we need to ask the question why that remains the case, whether it's a matter of racial and ethnic discrimination or an issue around people experiencing poverty. We know that access remains a critical human rights issue, and that's something that our president has spoken to, the importance of acknowledging the right to health, and not just that it's a privilege. And so the way we approach equity and the way we approach access is really by also thinking the importance of inclusion, the inclusion of people, again, who are disproportionately affected in the development or planning of these healthcare services, and the execution or implementation of those services, and finally in this monitoring and evaluation of whether or not it's even working. It's one of the reasons why we're so supportive of the Global AIDS strategy that, again, that was put forth by Winnie and her great leadership in UN AIDS that's taking us through 2026. We think that focus on eliminating inequalities is absolutely essential to the work that we all do. And it's also something that you've heard the Biden-Harris administration really put forth as a priority, this pillar around equity. And that's not just talk, right? That's something that has been demonstrated through the establishment of the COVID Equity Task Force that's been put in place, and also the establishment of a gender policy council at the White House, really focusing on how we close those gaps with regards to race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and the like. So I'd be remiss if I didn't link this to the Gender Equality Forum that we're going to sort of allow us to convene later this month, and the importance of sort of linking all of these high-level discussions, particularly as it relates to again, closing some of those gaps. But I'll finally offer my take on allies, and I know civil society has already been lifted up as part of this discussion. I am a proud former member of civil society and the advocacy community, and it goes without saying how essential they are to not just advocacy, but accountability, transparency, and generally the promotion of the ideals and values we want to see break through in all of this work. Of course, that partnership, that allyship needn't be limited to civil society. I think the private sector is critical in this regard, as are obviously philanthropic and governmental partnerships, but us all coming together and recognizing the importance of stakeholders at the table, driving these community-based, community-led services and programs will only better serve those at higher risk for HIV and other health priorities. So I'll close by reiterating the U.S.'s commitment to ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic globally. You had a statement that was sort of put forth by our president, marking the 40th, this quite sobering but critically important 40th anniversary, the emergence of the first cases around HIV/AIDS. And he said, our work is not finished, and really emphasize the importance of us rededicating ourselves to everything from science to service and really ending the epidemic, not just internationally, but here at home as well. And so you've seen that come through in our relationships and our engagements with groups like UNAIDS, like Global Fund, obviously the rededication of funds in that regard, including through our own PEPFAR program, recognizing again how all of those conditions and all of those initiatives are being sort of really brought to put at risk, by the current pandemic, and the importance of redoubling our efforts, recommitting our resources in that regard, not to mention all of the lessons that we can learn from those programs to really address the priority here at home and truly better serve those who are not quite yet, not really being reached with our services as well as they could be. So with that, I again thank you, Dr. Dhaliwal, for having us today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from our community and addressing those questions hereafter.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Lois, and thank you for highlighting the importance of holistic, integrated approaches. And we appreciate the incredible leadership of the U.S. government in the HIV response since for many, many years now. And it's an important role that you've played. And it's great to hear about the priority actions around addressing inequities and inequalities across a range of health issues and the right to health framing as priority areas. So let's move on now to a question and answer session and to hearing from people who've been joining us online. But before we do that, I'd like to thank the Vice President of Costa Rica, Her Excellency Epsi Campbell-Barr. She had to leave, but we really appreciate the time that she spent with us and for getting us off to a very inspired start. Our first intervention from the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, is from the Vice President of Gambia, Excellency Dr. Isatou Touré. You are very welcome. We'd love to hear from you. Questions, comments on what you've heard today in terms of what we need to do to remove the human rights barriers, stigma, and discrimination that are impeding the HIV response. Excellency Dr. Touré, over to you. Okay. Not sure if we can, or do we have a technical glitch with, yes, you're very welcome, Madame.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The chairperson and all other protocols respectfully and duly observed. I wish to express our appreciation for joining this very important meeting from the Gambia to note our commitment to address stigma and discrimination in the context of HIV, and to tell you we are now joining global partnership and initiative on addressing stigma and discrimination. And we will work with our partners at all levels to promote and to develop programs and projects that will help us facilitate addressing the human rights of this very vulnerable group. We are appreciative of the efforts that are being done, and the Gambia is pleased to announce that they will be part of this initiative and will engage constructively with our partners to move this process further. I wish to thank you all and to congratulate you for such a great initiative that has to deal with a very important issue.
Thank you so much, Excellency Touré. It is really, really a great honor to have you with us, and thank you for making this important statement in terms of joining the global partnership and for the commitment to action from the government of Gambia. Our next intervention is from a really, really inspiring leader from the front lines in the sex work movement. She has been an inspiration to so many of us over the years, and has really been devoted, dedicated, and energetic in leading the fight for sex workers' rights and in HIV responses. Elena Reñaga, over to you. You're very welcome.
Bueno, buenos días, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, sí, soy una trabajadora sexual, aunque ahora ya jubilada por la edad, pero lo soy, mi identidad no deja de serlo. Bueno, yo estoy profundamente agradecida, y para mí y para todas las poblaciones vulnerables de América Latina y el Caribe, la Alianza Global contra todo Estigma y Discriminación viene a ser el resultado del trabajo y del grito y de las voces que nosotras veníamos alzando hace muchos años, que no bastaba solamente con que nos sacaran sangre, con que nos hicieran registros sobre el tema de cuánto VIH teníamos, sino también que teníamos que trabajar imperiosamente en el tema de los derechos humanos, en que en esta región tiene que haber, en toda la región, matrimonio igualitario, identidad de género, legislación de la marihuana. Bueno, hay una serie de cosas que sufrimos todas las poblaciones, no solo las personas viviendo con VIH, sino todas las poblaciones vulnerables sufrimos el estigma y la discriminación. Digo, y hoy la pandemia, el COVID vino a mostrar que en América Latina y el Caribe los sistemas de salud son terriblemente débiles, son muy débiles, hay muy pocos recursos, ¿no es cierto? Nosotras, las personas viviendo con VIH estuvieron expuestas por varios meses hasta que abrieron un sistema de poderle llevar.
Elena, estás mute, Elena.
¿Qué pasa?
You're back.
Sí, se me silenció, no sé por qué. No, lo que quería decir era eso, ¿no? Que estuvimos muy expuestas, no hubo política de parte de los gobiernos para que nosotras pudiéramos comer, porque te piden que no salgas a trabajar para que no te infectes de COVID, pero tampoco te dan nada para que le sustentar tu vida. Y después otra cosa quiero agradecer, digo también qué es lo que está pasando ahora y qué es lo que viene pasando ahora y por qué llegamos a tener esta alianza global, gracias a una iniciativa también de la Red Global de Personas Viviendo, pero también de ONU-SIDA. ONU-SIDA ha sido una de las pocas agencias de Naciones Unidas que no ha sentado a la par. Y eso mismo necesitamos los gobiernos. Los gobiernos nos deben perder el miedo y entender que no somos el problema. Nosotras somos parte de la solución. Las poblaciones vulnerables somos parte, ¿me entiende?, de poder crear juntamente con nuestros gobiernos políticas. Y una cosa para terminar, ¿saben qué? Nos piden mucho activismo, pero el activismo no tiene recursos. Y la verdad que digamos, el alquiler no se paga solo con activismo, ¿no es cierto? Entonces nosotros necesitamos, nosotras y nosotras, para llevar adelante semejante iniciativa, necesitamos imperiosamente, no solamente fondos económicos de nuestros países, del Tesoro Nacional de nuestros países, sino de la cooperación, ¿no? Y que la cooperación entienda que en este momento, después de 40 años, necesitamos imperiosamente trabajar fundamentalmente en los derechos humanos para todas las poblaciones vulnerables. Muchas gracias por esta gran oportunidad, a Windy, a Alejandra Corau, a César Núñez, a todas las personas que hicieron posible esto.
Thank you so much, Elena. And I'm just looking at the chat to see if we have any questions, or is there anybody who'd like to take the floor? I don't see any. Okay, I see a hand up from Irene Bougainville. Can I ask you to come in? Irene, and please quickly just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and we can see.
Okay, hi, thank you. My name is Irene Bougainville. I'm from Indonesia, and I'm the humanitarian coordinator of the IPSF, International Pharmaceutical Students Federation. I'm so inspired and excited to hear the interventions from all the panelists. And I would like to ask this question to all the panelists who are interested to answer. So it's interesting that Peter just now mentioned that there is nothing that we can achieve alone. We need partnership. And Ms. Winnie called on other countries to be committed in the partnership, the global partnership, because now there are only still 21 countries. And as what she mentioned too, same-sex marriage, person who use drugs, or young sex workers are still criminalized in several countries, including in my country, Indonesia. If those countries which do not involve themselves in the partnership cannot do that because of the conservative beliefs and values of the country or its people, what is the recommendation from the UN bodies, especially UNAIDS, for youth or community-led organizations to address this issue? Because as you know, talking about beliefs and values is quite sensitive in my country here, and this can create chaotic movements, as for example, in this country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. And because we've gone a little bit over time, I'm going to ask the panelists to please respond to your question in the chat. Okay, but I think it's a very important question. So could I ask maybe Edwin, Harry, and others, and Peter to respond to you directly in the chat? I think it's quite important. And possibly colleagues from UNAIDS, if you could respond. The other thing I wanted to alert people to is that Alexandra Sasha from GNP Plus has put into the chat more information on the hashtag More Than campaign, that beautiful slide which Harry showed us. I encourage you to look at it. We'll certainly be looking at it. Veronica, literally 1 minute for your question, and then we're going to answer it in the chat, and then we're going to go to the closing. So if you could briefly introduce yourself and ask your question.
Muchas gracias, Verónica Russo de Argentina, referente CONOSUR para LAMPUT, la Red Latinoamericana de Personas que Usamos Sustancias Psicoactivas. Siguiendo la línea de Irene, la pregunta, agradezco a todo el panel y a Elena, sobre todo, tener una compañera compatriota y con tanto trabajo y militancia en el panel. La pregunta es con respecto al compromiso, sabiendo que no hay salud, ahora viene el 26 de junio, que es el día de Acompañe, no castigue. En esa línea, y escuchando ayer atentamente la aprobación y los desacuerdos sobre la declaración que se aprobó, en esta línea de la criminalización, creemos que no hay salud mental ni salud verdadera sin criminalización, sin pensar que vamos a ir preses, digo, todas las comunidades claves específicamente. Entonces, el compromiso, cómo seguiríamos, agradezco mucho a UNUCIDA todo su trabajo también, pero creo que hay que dar un paso más hacia la despenalización y la descriminalización de las poblaciones claves, especialmente ¿no? Usuarias de drogas, que atraviesan las poblaciones trans y las poblaciones trabajadoras sexuales, que son las más expuestas.
Thank you very much, and I think that's an important part of the global AIDS strategy and the call to action that's coming out of the strategy and the political declaration. And I encourage our panelists to reflect on both Veronica's comment and the question from Irene. It's now my pleasure to move to our closing remarks, which will be delivered by Ana Celeste Cardoso Januario. She's the Secretary of State for Human Rights and Citizenship in Angola. She was appointed Secretary of State in 2017 after a long-standing career in promoting and defending human rights in Angola. Prior to her current appointment, she was the National Director for Human Rights in Angola's Ministry of Justice and Human Rights and the Secretariat of State for Human Rights. She has played a critical role also as a legal consultant and advisor for various local and regional bodies, for example, the UN Office on Human Rights in Angola and the European Union delegation to Angola. Your Excellency, it is my great pleasure to hand you the floor to close us out. Over to you.
Muito obrigada, thank you. I will speak in português. Muito obrigada a todos, saudações protocolares, de acordo com o horário em que estiverem a nos ouvir. Bom dia, boa tarde ou boa noite. O meu primeiro agradecimento vai à organização e aos panelistas. É para nós uma honra participar neste evento, em nome do Governo da República de Angola, e congratulamos-nos com os progressos alcançados para o desenvolvimento e a adoção da Estratégia Global 21-26, que visa reduzir as desigualdades no combate à epidemia do SIDA e facilitar o acesso à informação e tratamento. Esta sessão sobre intensificar os esforços contra as barreiras dos direitos humanos, incluindo o estigma e a discriminação relacionada ao HIV, acontece numa altura em que o mundo continua a enfrentar e abordar os efeitos da pandemia da Covid-19. Estes efeitos não devem fazer esquecer as outras epidemias, como já foi referenciado aqui várias vezes. Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, em consonância com a estratégia do HIV-Sida, recentemente adotada, e a meta 10-10-10, dos quais o acesso à justiça e a abordagem do estigma e da discriminação são fundamentais, o governo de Angola trabalha na adoção de várias medidas legais e institucionais para combater o HIV-Sida e assim proteger o direito dos cidadãos. Em termos de legislação, foram aprovados vários diplomas que visam defender a dignidade da pessoa humana e em todas as circunstâncias e condições, a começar da Constituição da República, a Lei de Base do Sistema Nacional de Saúde, a Lei da HIV, o Regulamento do HIV, Emprego e Formação Profissional e, mais recentemente, o nosso Código Penal angolano. Ainda neste domínio, o Estado angolano aderiu aos principais documentos internacionais e regionais de direitos humanos e VIH-Sida. Estamos a incorporar estes documentos nos diplomas legais nacionais, com vista à salvaguarda da dignidade da pessoa humana. Do mesmo modo, há um alinhamento com as diretivas das Nações Unidas e as diretivas da União Africana em matéria de direitos humanos e HIV, com destaque para a Agenda 2030 e a Agenda Africana 2063, cujo escopo é a sustentabilidade em todos os domínios da humanidade. Do ponto de vista institucional, temos uma comissão de grandes endemias, o Instituto Nacional de Luta contra a SIDA, com representação a nível nacional. Estão a ser reforçadas as unidades hospitalares para o combate à HIV-Sida. Foi criada uma unidade especializada, o Hospital Esperança. Existem centros de aconselhamento e testagem voluntária. Angola aderiu também à campanha Nascer Livre para Brilhar, liderada pela primeira-dama. A Política Nacional de Saúde, o Plano de Desenvolvimento Nacional 2018-2022. Temos também um plano estratégico de combate ao HIV-Sida. Este plano enquadra-se num ambiente jurídico favorável a zero discriminação, desde a perspectiva dos direitos humanos para as pessoas que vivem com HIV-Sida e população-chave. Todos estes compromissos ajudaram-nos a avançar e acelerar os nossos esforços para o alcançar. Estamos certos que uma boa resposta multissetorial para acabar com o VIH-Sida precisa de ter um trabalho conjunto e ter sistemas mais fortes. Excelências, no que diz respeito ao combate à estigmatização e à discriminação, o Código Penal angolano, promulgado a 11 de novembro de 2020, inclui artigos que proíbem e responsabilizam todos os tipos de discriminação. Neste âmbito, estamos a realizar ações com destaque para a implementação da Estratégia Nacional de Direitos Humanos e do seu plano de ação, cujo objetivo é criar a cultura e respeito dos direitos humanos em todo o território nacional. O plano terá a participação direta no apoio jurídico e na criação do ambiente jurídico favorável às pessoas que vivem com HIV-Sida e população-chave. A sua implementação terá como participação todos os atores, instituições públicas, sociedade civil, população-chave e parceiros como o UNDP e ONU-SIDA. A taxa de prevalência nacional da HIV-Sida em Angola é estimada em 2% de uma população de 15 a 49 anos, uma das mais baixas da região austral. Entretanto, o desafio de Angola continua para controlar a propagação. Estamos a considerar aderir à parceria global proposta pela ONU-SIDA, uma vez que dá-nos uma excelente oportunidade para o país que está a trabalhar na eliminação da estigma e da discriminação em cenários que ajudariam a melhorar o acesso a serviços para pessoas que vivem ou são afetadas pelo HIV-Sida. E acrescentar, estamos em processo de revisão à nossa lei da HIV-Sida para conformar com as novas exigências atuais, particularmente a questão do combate à estigmatização e à discriminação, a incorporação dos grupos vulneráveis e populações-chaves, garantir a proteção das pessoas vivendo com HIV-Sida e criar um ambiente jurídico favorável. No entanto, temos claro que sem a liderança e o empoderamento da comunidade em todas essas intervenções, não seríamos capazes de fazer a diferença na resposta. Eles são e têm de estar no centro da resposta do HIV-Sida. Esta é uma oportunidade para chamarmos a atenção à doença e mostrar a solidariedade internacional face à pandemia. É uma ocasião para os parceiros envolvidos nesta luta reverem a situação, as realizações e os desafios para continuar o progresso até aqui conseguido alcançar. A redução do número de infecção, 0 novas infecções, 0 discriminação e 0 mortes face da HIV-Sida. As mulheres, as meninas, população-chave, LGBTIQ+, trabalhadoras do sexo, pessoas que usam drogas injetáveis e pessoas que se encontram nas cadeias, parceiros e parceiras em todo o mundo continuam a ser desproporcionalmente afetados e afetadas pela pandemia do VIH-Sida. Gostaríamos que todos e todas nos sentíssemos sujeitos ativos na promoção de uma cultura dos direitos humanos, de igualdade e não discriminação, enquanto pilares da construção de uma sociedade inclusiva, aberta, cujo fundamento é e deve ser a dignidade da pessoa humana. Para terminar, Angola saúda uma vez mais a dedicação e empenho do Programa das Nações Unidas para o SIDA e reitera o apelo à renovação dos compromissos do Estado. Esse apelo vai para que todos e todas trabalhemos por um mundo sem discriminação pelo HIV-Sida. Teus direitos, nossos deveres. Muito obrigada. Many thanks. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for an inspiring close. So it just leaves me to say, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, and everyone who has participated online, thank you. We want to pay tribute to everyone on the front lines for everything that you do, often putting yourselves at risk. The Global AIDS Strategy, the political declaration, is our collective call to action. We the people, all equal in dignity and worth, united in our efforts and our urgency to end AIDS as a public health threat, demand and must do all that we can to dismantle the human rights, legal, and policy barriers, the inequalities that are impeding progress on AIDS and leaving no one behind. I hope you all leave this session energized and reinvigorated to end inequalities and to end HIV/AIDS across the world by 2030.